And now, during the interval, André Previn and John Georgiadis, conductor and leader of the London Symphony Orchestra, talk to Anthony Friese-Greene.
It is seldom that one has a chance of speaking to the principal conductor and leader of one of the world's foremost orchestras. And you, Mr. Previn and Mr. Georgiadis, hold these positions with the London Symphony Orchestra. You, Mr. Previn, are American, and the high polish and technical brilliance of the best orchestras in the States must be a condition which you come to expect without asking. Do you consider that the LSO's fame is, in part anyhow, due to a similar striving after technical polish and glass?
Well, I don't even think it strives for technical polish and glass. I think it has it and can unleash it any time it wants to. I think that no orchestra's technical brilliance can be taken for granted. In other words, even if you are conducting Cleveland, Boston, Chicago, or anything, you still have to elicit it from the players. And the LSO, I think, has it in reserve as much or more than any of the orchestras I mentioned in the United States. I think the LSO is the greatest combination of brilliance and sensitivity of any other orchestra in the world.
What is your reaction to that, John? I mean, as sitting down, rather facing Mr. Previn here.
Well, the LSO is capable of, in the same day that we might be recording big pieces, Mahler's Symphony or something, could also do film sessions and have the alertness and speedy reactions that are often given only to light music people. It can react quickly in both worlds. This is one of the things that makes it very nice to play with.
One thing about English orchestras in general, and the LSO in particular, is that the sight reading capabilities of English orchestras are infinitely faster than those of American orchestras. It's an extraordinary talent. I don't know whether you, John, when you go to school here, is that something they stress?
I can't remember actually if that's something they stress. I do remember that there's a tremendous competitive feeling about sight reading, especially when I was at the Royal Academy of Music. There were a group of young fiddlers there all competing strongly for supremacy in one form or another, and sight reading was definitely the challenge. Playing in orchestra, those that could whistle through the first fiddle parts quickest.
Well, it's a terrific thrill for a conductor, because I know, as a matter of fact, I think it's possible to say that sometimes an orchestra that sight reads as brilliantly as the LSO plays a piece better first time through than the second time through, which is something that you want to explain that?
Well, I must say that often it's very easy to over-rehearse with the LSO. You lose the feeling of spontaneity if it's rehearsed.
Yes, I've been hearing that for years, John.
Would you say that there's more competitiveness in the British orchestra rather than the American one?
Competitiveness, what, among the orchestras? Or amongst
competitiveness for getting the positions, the top positions in the orchestras.
Well, I wouldn't think so. I would think that would be the same all over.
We're closer together in London. I think that gives us a feeling of actually competing amongst the
that's what I was rather
major
meaning.
Orchestras. Yes,
Well, you mean your orchestras, you see, are in cities which are dotted much further away.
Oh, excuse me. I thought you meant amongst the players for position within one orchestra.
No.
You mean the orchestras?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, I think it, just as John says, it's much more necessary for one of the 5 London orchestras to feel that it is at the top than it would be, for the Boston to think that it was better than Philadelphia because of the fact that so many miles separate them.
Now, of course, you talk about this tremendous sight reading on the British orchestra side. I understand that Philadelphia also has a tremendous sight reading propensity. Is that so?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, actually, I suppose any great orchestra has amazing sight reading capacities. Curiously enough, I would think the most startling sight reading capacities are the players who have kind of given up and now play only Hollywood studios. They almost all have immense symphonic backgrounds, but they have decided to settle in the sunshine, and because of the fact that they never play repertoire and play new music literally every day of their lives, the sight reading is extraordinary. But when I said that the LSO and the English orchestras have amazing sight reading qualities, I didn't mean it to the detriment of the Philadelphia necessarily, but I know that I'm always startled by a piece that I have slaved to decipher at home for X amount of days or weeks, and then it's whipped off so that there's nothing left to do.
Now, John, I know that in this recording that's just gone out, you played the first violin concerto by Bartók. You are also, of course, leader of the London Symphony Orchestra. How do you find this dual role? Do you find it comes easily to you?
Well, I think it's necessary, really. It's necessary from many aspects. Sort of self-respect comes into it, and just the need to keep oneself in that sort of trim, concerto playing trim. I'm not one of the leaders that has big ambitions to play concertos frequently. I just like to be able to keep my hand in, as it were.
You're not like one of your predecessors who would say, eventually, say in a few years' time, retire from the LSO and just devote yourself entirely to solo playing.
No, I feel much more of an orchestral musician. My heart lies really with the big symphony music. And really, playing concertos comes to me in the same field as chamber music and perhaps even small classical orchestras. I'd like to, I like to have as varied life as possible.
We all try to do that. I mean, for instance, John and Doug Cummings, our principal cellist, and I are doing some trio concerts, and we all play chamber music and try to vary our lives. But you see, the thing that's marvelous about the principals in the LSO is this may sound like a redundancy, and that it may even sound silly, but they all love music. And they all love playing, and they have very definite likes and dislikes and even passions about certain kinds of music, and it doesn't become routine. I mean, I don't think anybody ever says, oh God, here it is again with, the Eroica. I think everybody feels very strong personal views on all these things, and that always makes for an interesting performance.
I think that's probably further by the fact that you've got so many soloists in the London Symphony Orchestra. I mean, in the key positions.
We even have about 4 conductors.
But do you think that it's a good thing that this should be extended, that principals in an orchestra should do solo work? I mean, solo work in the sense of a concerto with the orchestra in which they're involved.
Well, there are, the various soloists in the orchestra that play concertos and give recitals outside the orchestra. It doesn't happen all that frequently. They actually do it with the LSO.
Do you think they ought to do it more with other orchestras as well? I mean, it sometimes is frowned upon, isn't it? Say that a woodwind player, particularly a woodwind player, goes and plays a solo with another orchestra, which is not directly...
I think if the player is sufficiently established, for instance, Gervais Depin and Barry Tuckle when he was with the LSO, I mean, these are players that would be accepted to play concertos with any orchestra, I'm sure, any orchestra in the world.
Well, you obviously, Mr. Previn, think this is a very good idea, because I know you've done more than just this Bartók first concerto with John.
Oh yes, we've done 3, 4, 5 concertos, but I tell you the way I feel about people from the orchestra playing concertos is that I like to have it depend on the wish to present a specific work rather than to present a specific soloist. I would hate to feel that every year we owe every principal a concerto. On the other hand, for instance, I heard and fell in love with the flute concerto by Nielsen, and that's a piece that's not played very much, so it would be a good evening's addition to have that on. Now, we're lucky insofar as that we have a brilliant flute player, and that, I think, should determine the usage of a soloist from the orchestra's ranks, not simply because, well, he's so good he's got to play this season.
Now, here's a question I'd like to ask you both. To what extent do you consider a conductor should invite suggestions from the leader? And I mean not just the bowing and fingering.
Should invite or get?
Well, I know you've got definite feelings, Mr. Previn, on John as a leader. So perhaps you'd tell us.
Shall I leave?
No, well, I tell you something. We were talking about you before when we were looking for you out in the foyer, and I said that I thought that you were the best leader that I'd ever come across on either continent. So that what happens is that when we disagree not on the method of how to achieve a certain something, but just on a general approach to a piece of music. And of course, when we disagree in the dressing room, after the concert, or over a drink, or playing with John's miniature trains or something. We don't do it in front of the orchestra. But I frankly would and I think do often ask your advice on things.
Oh yes. Yeah, I must say, from my point of view, it so depends on who is on the box. And if if I feel particularly strongly about a piece of music, and I feel there's a possibility I might just be able to sway the conductor.
Yes. I had great luck with Zell with that.
Yeah, well,
tell us more.
I must say, a few years' experience has taught me a better sense of timing. No, it's if I feel strongly enough, I feel like it's almost my duty to a degree to at least have a go in the best way possible. And if it really comes to the situation that I want to make suggestions but I don't, then it really isn't. It isn't such a. It means my heart's not in it. If I'm really feel I can get somewhere or want to discuss something with a conductor, whether it's invited or not, at least it means I'm wholeheartedly there with the performance. I'm extremely interested in the outcome.
That's quite true. The other thing that you see, I feel, is this: there is no conductor in the world that has ever conducted the standard repertoire as often as a player in an orchestra has played it. So it's just simply not possible mathematically. So therefore, if there is a fine point technically in a Tchaikovsky symphony, in a Brahms symphony, and whatever have you, it is very likely one that has escaped the conductor, or at least it's possible. Whereas the player very likely has played it 20 times that season. So I think it would be the height of conceit for a conductor not to invite that kind of comment.
So I imagine then that you rather don't go along with Ormandy's saying that when asked about what is a Philadelphia sound, he says, "A Philadelphia sound? That's me." You don't go along with him in that.
Well, I think I will go along with him insofar as that he has had that orchestra now for 30-odd years, and it is a recognizable sound. He is a string player, and he likes to have a most specifically luxurious sheen and brilliance in the strings, and that is something that he has worked on and something that is apparent. However, with all due deference, and even more than that, homage to Mr. Ormandy, I don't think one can say the Philadelphia sound is me, for the very simple fact that if they all left the stage and left him standing on the rostrum, there would be no sound at all.
I think, especially with regard to Mr. Ormandy, that this is in part true, because, for instance, when he came to us, really, he could almost, in the short period allotted to him with rehearsals, begin to get the so-called Philadelphia sound with the LSO string.
That's true. No, I must tell you that even, I'll give you another example. Last December, there was the opening of the new Juilliard Music School in New York, and there was a concert, and it was quite fancy. They had a lot of marvelous soloists, Shirley Verrett and Itzhak Perlman and Van Cliburn. And they were conducted by various people. It was a student orchestra, and the student orchestra was not as good as the Leicestershire School's orchestra, for instance, but passable and nice. And then to finish, Stokowski came up and did Meistersinger Prelude, and it was suddenly an absolutely first-rate orchestra with the strings gleaming and burnished. And so there is a lot to people like Stokowski and Ormandy who have that specific and personal effect upon the orchestra.
Yes, one can't deny that. I mean, I've had a lot of work with student orchestras, and I found that where you have a fine conductor, he will bring out something that the conventional conductor or the conductor that goes to the orchestra doesn't do. I mean, one can't deny, too, that, I mean, Zell, for instance, has created the Cleveland for what it is now. I mean, that's true, I think, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, it's always considered a highlight of our season, to have George Zell come. It's a pretty terrifying week, mind you, but for everybody concerned, but it's always well worth it, and certainly the orchestra's on its toes.
He has the most extraordinary ear, he really does. I mean, I remember hearing the Cleveland, and for instance, the last few pages of Brahms 3, those chords, the woodwind chords, are so immaculately balanced. I mean, it's not just precision playing, it's immense what he's done with the Cleveland.
Now, in the second half of the programme, Mr. Previn, you are performing Gershwin's piano concerto. At the end of last year, you were involved in what turned out to be a controversial EBU broadcast about this composer, in which a part of the slow movement of the concerto being played was entirely devoted to his songs, either sung or in piano transcriptions by the composer, which you yourself played. Now, Hans Keller was taken to task, I think rather unjustly, for presumably seeking to advance Gershwin's prestige as a serious composer through the song part of his output. And some correspondence in the Listener after the broadcast was pretty aggressive. One listener saying that, and I quote, Gershwin wasn't alone. He belongs with Kern, Rogers, Berlin, Porter, and he enumerates a lot of composers. There is more than one genius there, he goes on to say. Singling out Gershwin is as Philistine as ignoring every early 19th century composer but Beethoven, unquote. My feeling here is that this correspondent has a point, but only a point. Kern indeed wrote some wonderful tunes, and some other composers not mentioned by this correspondent, such as Hoagy Carmichael, his Stardust is a very fine melody, and that of De Rose's Deep Purple. Now, my feeling is that this program sought to further Gershwin in the area where he is more vulnerable when considered as a genius. Would you agree with me, Mr. Previn, that Gershwin had this dichotomy of approach to music, the popular and the serious? And it was in the large-scale works like Rhapsody in Blue, the Piano Concerto, An American in Paris, and his opera Porgy and Bess that he surpassed the other names I've just mentioned. Although certainly in these works his genius shone only intermittently, the fact remains that they all show that Gershwin could think more symphonically than any of the others. What are your views on this?
Do you want to repeat the question? I tell you, I think that, first of all, it's difficult to say the word genius, because I think if, for instance, Mozart is a genius and Shakespeare is a genius, then Gershwin has a very long way to go. On the other hand, if Hoagy Carmichael is a genius, then Gershwin is 10 geniuses,
Mm-hmm.
But that's semantics. I think that I must tell you that what I find admirable about Gershwin is the fact that he was an immense success, very wealthy, very lionized and sought after as a songwriter and a Broadway show composer, and so that he did not need to pursue his musical education to the degree that led him to writing overtures, concertos, and an opera, other than a burning personal ambition to become a greater musician. So that is something that cannot be faulted, and for which people should have the highest possible respect, because I think that the concerto, for all its weaknesses, and Porgy for its structural weaknesses, are brilliant, brilliant pieces. But I do feel that those sections of the concerto, the Rhapsody and Porgy, that are the best sections are those which he could have also turned into tunes. And I think that his, if you like, genius consisted in writing a very stylish and personal and recognizable 32-bar phrase. And whether he put that into the middle of American in Paris or as a song for the Astairs in one of his early shows is simply a matter of surroundings.
But on the other hand, he did manage to treat symphonically, and that's the word I especially use, a work of much greater length than those other pop composers.
Oh, well, there was no comparison, because you see, don't forget that the other people whom we've talked about, although their songs, their popular songs, are brilliant and inimitable, they were and they remain musical primitives. And they didn't care. I mean, no one can write a better pop song of that era than Irving Berlin, but Irving Berlin couldn't even write down the melody. Well, it didn't seem to matter much, because he did turn out such lovely things. And so Gershwin's ambition and the resultant pieces of his ambition are terrific. But I still think, in a way, I kind of agree with Mr. Keller that which makes him unique is the personality in those melodies of his, and not necessarily the big pieces. I think he would have developed. Don't forget, he died tragically early, at 37 or 8. If he had been allowed to live his life out, he might have very well forsaken the songwriting and become a very, very important composer. But I will tell you, just to be the devil's advocate, that when people talk about American composers, you know, Copland and Ives and so forth, I will include Gershwin because I think he was among the maybe 5 most important composing talents that have ever come out of the United States.
Yes, well, I feel that way too. And now, when I hear that second subject in the first movement of the piano concerto, I mean, the way he treats it symphonically when it comes at the end, I think that is the hallmark of genius there too.
Oh yes, that's a particularly beautiful moment. Yeah.
André Previn and John Georgiadis, conductor and leader of the London Symphony Orchestra, were talking to Anthony Friese-Greene.